So, Paul,
Yeah.
we have spoken before about creativity, and I know that you work with the solutions focus approach. So, let me ask you some questions about how having a focus on solutions, how is that in alignment with an emergent approach? Do you think that the two harmonize, or do you think that an emergent approach to creating solutions that, or just embracing solutions that appear that are unplanned and unforeseen, is that the same, or do we need to be in a very different mindset to that compared with having a clear kind of goal and a solution in mind?
Yes, so I think they are coherent and they harmonise well. So the essential part of a solution-focused approach is that you look ahead to what you want, a vision, and then you look at what happens moment by moment, emergently, and see whether or not it's lining up with that vision. So creativity would come into making your vision in the first place. You might make it with conversation, video, or newspapers, or any form of media that's useful to you or your group. And then that gives you something that you can aim at and that you can check against. It gives you signs and indicators of when you're getting parts of what you want or all of what you want for a brief period of time. And then the emergent part is moment by moment, you notice what's happening around you, what's changing and what's different, and you can match that up and say, oh yeah, that's a bit more like what we wanted, or that's a small piece of what we wanted to happen is happening now with this team, with that person, or with that project. So it combines the best of looking ahead, knowing what you want, and working emergently with whatever happens, keeping the bits that work and ditching the bits that don't.
Yeah, that's so, yeah, I'm so glad that you've summarized it so well there. And I think the key part is checking, that I would call that being responsive to the feedback that we receive. So constantly being responsive. And as you say, checking to see what works and what we need to do more of. I know that you like to use that approach of like, do more of what works and do less of what doesn't work, right?
Yes, absolutely. I've just written an article on feedback today, and feedback often consists of telling someone what they've done wrong and hoping that from that information they'll be inspired and motivated to do better. And of course, it very rarely works. So you need to explain to people what it is you want to see instead of what they have done wrong, and see if they buy into that vision or desired preferred state of affairs. And then if they know how to do it, and watching out moment by moment as to whether that is making a difference or not. So if you don't complete the loop with checking, then you're going to be left rather rudderless and astray. So yes, check as you go along. And that has an implication of being very aware of where we are in the moment and being present, which is good in all sorts of other ways too. Improvisers talk about being a moment. And of course, we're doing that within a context of awareness of what's just been happening and some sense of where we want to go, but we locate ourselves with more attention paid to what's going on around us now, so we can adapt and adjust much more rapidly.
And it's a very behaviorist kind of approach, isn't it? Like reinforcement. We reinforce what we like, what we want to see to strengthen, and we punish what we don't want, by dismissing it, by ignoring it, by overlooking it.
Or letting it go. I don't think it has to be a punishment. If we treat things as being experimental.
Yeah, the term punishment seems strong, but punishment can simply be ignoring something. That can be punishment. But in the behaviorist approach, they do have those two terms, don't they? Like one is positive, one is negative, and the positive is you're enhancing, you're reinforcing, and the negative is you are trying to weaken that impact.
Yes, I think it does have those reinforcing elements, but without any kind of moral judgment that punishing maybe brings up for some people. So letting things go, and that's easy to do if you're taking a view of things being experimental, provisional, or see them as part of a dynamic, constantly changing system. rather than absolute failures or successes. We're looking for progress and the things that are contributing to progress. And as you say, we reinforce those. While the things that aren't working, we can stop doing them, let them go, abandon them. But it doesn't have to be done very heavily. It's just shifting this way or shifting that way, like a yacht tacking through the water. It's adjusting with the current, with the winds, and with the destination in mind.
It seems to be a very ecological kind of approach, you know, this emergence, this allowing, this, you know, creating the spaces and just seeing what happens and responding to what is occurring.
Absolutely, it's one of my favourite words. So I edited an environmental magazine when I was at university, and I've been very interested in ecology and climate change. Gregory Bateson's Steps to an Ecology of Mind, looking at the system, how one thing affects another thing, how life is much more complex, and organisations are part of complex life, but we often describe them as if they're very fixed, very mechanical, that cause and effect is easily identified. And I think this is wrong. It's much subtler than that. And there's all sorts of things that we can do to influence events and influence each other, and a lot less that we can do to control them, which is the old command and control way of management that fits with that old way of conceiving of an organisation as fixed, static, and subject to mechanics and levers. It's not, it's a life form, and it's very subtle and nuanced.
Absolutely. And I suppose this current coronavirus pandemic is forcing us to see everything in a complex, you know, that there are no simplistic linear cause and effect relationships that will explain what is happening. We need to see the complexity, and we need to see it from an ecological point of view. So that granted, there seems to be benefits in thinking from an ecological point of view, the way nature works, but we as human beings, the difference is that when we just take simply an ecological point of view, we're not taking into account ethics, we're not taking into account morality or culture, because those are human capabilities. They're not inherent in nature as such. And the coronavirus, when it affects some parts of society more adversely than other parts of society, we can think of that as an ethical and a cultural issue, whereas ecology doesn't explain it, right?
I completely agree with you that these are ethical, cultural, political, economic considerations. I don't see why we wouldn't include all of that within what you could call a wider ecology or a wider context. There's a lot of very simplistic thinking that goes on, and it's really easy to blame this or that government or this or that policy when you take it in isolation. It doesn't seem to fit with the wider ethical and social concerns. And that's because our conversation is, especially around politics, is very polarized about this or that, blame or cheer, rather than where are we on a continuum or on a scale of, can we make it a bit better? Can we check that our improvement of this having a detrimental effect on that? And that requires people to hold paradoxes in mind, competing ideas, testing of theories, and not jumping to a conclusion and short-term gaining of the ends. You're looking at countries that have responded differently to coronavirus, and we put some in the lead and some behind after a couple of weeks. And then it looks very different. If you look at how they're all doing 6 months later, will no doubt look different again in 2 years. And I think it's okay for people not to know, or to say it's too early to tell, and to try and encourage people to have that patience, certainly in political and social realms, but also in organisations. There's more short-term thinking than the medium and long-term thinking that might lead to better results.
I suppose some people have taken a survival of the fittest approach, you know, either on an individual or societal level. It's survival of the fittest. And when we take that approach, that intention creates an emergence and impact, which is quite distinct to others who take well, no, let's protect the vulnerable. Let's protect the vulnerable is a very different approach to survival of the fittest, and that creates a different, it leads to emergence of a different set of variables, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I studied politics and philosophy at university, and it's absolutely different value systems. And if we say we've got a society in which we want to protect the vulnerable and look after each other and think about community rather than just profit or short-term gain or what's the easiest thing to do, then we're going to have very different policies and very different results. I think we see that in different countries. Trump in America, I'm speaking very broadly here, but he doesn't seem to care about the vulnerable minorities or that kind of gradual social progress or social change. Whereas here, there's a lot of defense of the National Health Service, which was set up for the benefit of all and that everyone pays into as part of a progressive tax system. And we're making choices about that. But as individuals, we do contribute to that by how we act politically, both locally and nationally. So it's not something that's just to us, it's something that we can respond to and continue to have influence over.
Right. And then the other thing about our approaches is that one is like, when we're thinking about solutions, it seems to be very goal oriented, whereas when we look at the emergence, it might not ever lead to solutions. It might lead to more and more problems. Emergent features are not always beneficial. So survival of the fittest, that might not be a solution in itself.
Yes, the solution, the word solution in solution focus is a bit misleading because it gets people to think about what do we do next or how do we solve this particular problem. And we're not really intending to use it. We're not really intending to use it in that way. We're using solution to mean the desired state of affairs, how we would like things to be, the best we could imagine them to be, how we would like our team to be operating, how we'd like our society to be functioning if it were doing well. We mean by the solution that we have in mind. So it's not the best name for the process or the technique for that reason. And I support solutions in the sense of what is it that we want to have happen rather than what's the quick fix for this thing or that thing. That's the other use of the word.
Right. Yes. And one thing I love about your approach is the future perfect. You start with that, like, how we're creating this future perfect. And I suppose in a way that is emergence as well, that when we think about our future perfect, our ideal future, and we start to take steps, even at the thought level towards that, that leads to I don't know, we're creating spaces and opportunities that might not have been there if the intention wasn't there.
Yeah, absolutely, beautifully put. It's exactly that. The future perfect is what I'm talking about for the solution or the best it could be or how we like things to be. And the very act of talking about that with a group of people in their circumstances starts to get people excited about it. They are participating in the creation of it by sensing the possibility, giving it their vote of approval, and being tuned in then to looking out for parts of it happening. So talking about it is part of doing it. It's not all of doing it. You still have to take actions and watch the feedback, as we were talking about earlier. But it's a great starting point, first step of what do we want? I'm not hearing people in these times of COVID asking enough of those sorts of questions, like how would we like our society to be when we come out of the current crisis and have the post-COVID world that we want? What's that going to be like? And then people will have to answer whether they want it to be survival of the fittest or a more equitable society. We'll know what they're aiming for, and then we can agree that or disagree it and start taking steps towards it. And the first step towards it is describing it in detail.
And I suppose one of the reasons that people aren't asking those questions is because they're too busy asking questions about when are things going to go back to normal.
Yes.
The way they
Which
were.
they're not. Yes. It's goodbye to that world. I've done some research with a think tank that I'm part of, into what's happening in organizations. And the first insight from that is it's really clear there's no going back. People have experienced a difference, and it was a really dramatic difference, and all of us experienced it at the same time. And that's led to changes in our personal preferences of where we want to work, how often we want to work. Organizations are going to recalibrate how they use their offices and people's time. And the economics of things have changed as well. There's businesses gone out of operation, people are facing different economic circumstances. So you can't bring it back to how it was. Of course, we can have elements of that, but we've got to look at something new and different. And I know some people don't like to do that. I just wish it could be the way it was. And that's not going to make it so, because things have changed radically enough and with enough different people being involved that it's already shifted and can't shift back. So the question is to ask, how do we want it to shift on? What do we want to keep about what we've been experiencing lately? And what do we want to keep about what we had before, and find a new combination?
Right. And I think the coronavirus is an excellent example of presence, emergence, and impact, the feedback loop, because the
Yes.
presence of this virus has made such a huge and deep impact on us that our presence has changed, has transformed. And as you say,
Yes.
there is no going back. You can't put the genie back into the bottle.
Yes. People like to think that the plan determined what happened, but when the thing didn't go according to plan, for everyone, everywhere, that was a real indication that you can't rely on the plan. You have to look at the reality, and the reality has radically, significantly changed. So let's get into the moment of this is how things are now, and look at the future of what we do want to have as a result of it, with our own choices being fed into our companies, to our families, to the government, internationally through organizations that we can now connect with through Zoom and other ways of expanding geography, and come up with something preferable. And of course, it's very responsive, and we're not going to be able to say this is the exact way to get there, but we can say this is where we would like to go, and start noticing when we can accomplish it, what skills and resources we've got that are going to help contribute towards that. It's a very different way of working at it. It's emergent, it's improvisational, and it can be solution-based if you choose to take that approach towards it.
Yeah. And the theme for this year's conference is presence, and presence can be like your physical presence, but I think, you know, presence is also through the books you've written, for example. So when you wrote Solutions Focus, and that presence is still there, you obviously anticipated an emergence. You know, everyone who writes a book, I'm sure, knows that it will have some sort of impact, even if it's tiny, even if it's only your family that reads the book, it will lead to an emergence of something or other, and then it'll make some impact, and that impact transforms our presence. So for you, that feedback loop, you know, I know it's not the only book that you've written, but it's one book that is there on my shelf. It's been on my shelf for a long time, for 2 decades probably. So, and the reason that we're having this conversation is because you wrote that book. I probably wouldn't have met you if you hadn't written that book. Now we're having this conversation, so that's one of the features of the emergent features that was not planned by yourself. It wasn't planned by me. It derived from you having written that book. So what's the feedback loop? In what way has that book and your books made an impact on you and transformed your presence?
I think you're absolutely right that the things that we create, books, videos, I used to be a journalist and I wrote a lot of articles, that we put them out in the world as an act of creation and as an act of hope and an act of record, and something will happen with them. And we don't know what that's going to be. Book sales, notoriously difficult to predict. I'm glad that my books, I've written or co-written 6 books. The sales they're in the thousands rather than dozens or even hundreds of thousands, but that's reached a lot of people. And the feedback I get is often surprising and unexpected. So someone like you may come and interview me, but as you say, just wouldn't have happened otherwise. Or I'll get a note from somebody by email on how something that I wrote or did on a video has made a difference for them. And it's delightful to hear that. And it's a shame that with something that you put out into the world that isn't you yourself, but is some sort of artifact, you can't always get that immediate feedback to know what difference it's making. So that's the act of hope, is that what we're doing has got some ripple effect or value that it continues to add. And when you do get those reports back, or stories that you hear, or you meet people years later that you met on a course years before, and they've told you about something that you said that made a difference to them, that's very gratifying and very pleasing, and moments to treasure.
Well, I think with doing something creative like writing a book, I think it really helps to have the emergent kind of philosophy rather than a linear philosophy. Those who expect linear, tangible results are often disappointed. If people write a book thinking, well, I'm going to complete the book in January, and by March I will have made $1 million, and I will be
Good
world
luck
wealthy.
to them.
That's right.
Yes.
You see, and then they get disappointed when those linear goals that they have set themselves don't manifest. Whereas if you see it, you've done something creative and you see it like scattering the seeds, and you don't know when those seeds are going to be nurtured and to emerge into fruition, then that's a much more wholesome way of approaching it. And then you get surprise requests to be interviewed, decades down the line.
Yes, it's also more ecological, to reference what you were talking about before. And it's important to enjoy the process rather than be dependent on the results. Of course, you want some results, and if you do a week's work, you may want a week's pay. That's completely reasonable and fair. But there's much more available to us in the world of possibilities emergently than there is linearly in many circumstances. So if you're enjoying the process and the writing is worthwhile for its own sake, because it's articulating your ideas or getting something from a whole bunch of notes into a more refined form, then that's great. And you've got reward anyway. And if there's further rewards, then that's absolutely wonderful, unexpected, unpredictable, not predictable results. And for me, the greatest rewards I've had have been these unpredictable ones, of conversations with people that I wasn't expecting to have, access to places that I never thought I'd be able to go. And none of it could have been put down in a plan of, write this, then that will happen, because you just have no way of knowing. The world is far too complex to be predictable, even in principle, let alone in practice.
That's right, because with creativity, some of the most creative things that we see manifested have happened through serendipity, and that can't be planned. The very nature of serendipity is that it's unpredictable, it's unforeseen, it happens through so-called coincidences and accidental
Yes.
and emergence, and also synchronicity. Synchronicity can't be planned. It occurs almost by luck.
You can create conditions in which it's more likely to happen. And so it's not just let's hope. There are things we can do to increase the prospect of that kind of serendipity. So if you think of the good design of offices where people are encouraged to bump into more different, diverse people than be kept in their cubicles all day, then there's likely to be more of those kinds of encounters, some of which, and we don't know which ones they will be, some of which will spark off the new ideas, the new inventions. So I know that companies like Google use that as a deliberate design technique, Apple as well. And we can do that with conferences where we have plenty of meeting spaces, lots of coffee time, lots of breaks, where we've got that chance for interaction rather than just listening to one speaker after another. So we can design for increasing the prospects of creativity and serendipity.
That's right. And also, like, a lot of people will say they were just queuing for an airport, for a flight, and they spoke with the person next to them in the queue. If they hadn't spoken, or if they hadn't spoken to the passenger next to them, that conversation which led to other opportunities wouldn't have happened. So there is this, we do need to be open, we need to be observant, and perhaps we need to be alert as well.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why we're not going to stay only online, and that it's going to be important to be in positions to meet people again by accident, more randomly, with more mixing, because we depend on that for a lot of the creative things that happen. And I'm a big fan of design and facilitation. I spend a lot of my time doing those things professionally. So even if a group of people are together, you can't expect a great conversation to break out necessarily just by chance. But if you get people into groups of good size for a conversation, and you give them a good prompt or a good question to talk about, then you're radically increasing the chances of a good or productive conversation. So that's how we design conferences and meetings, so that they're more productive and more enjoyable.
Mm. And also, this thing about impact versus outcome, very, very often in organizations, there's very much of a focus on clear outcomes rather than what is the impact that you want to have. Maybe the outcome might not be, you might start off by thinking that that's the particular outcome you want, but if through that process things emerge, the impact may be more important than the outcome that was intentioned to start off with.
Yes. Yeah. That's why the Future Perfect, which we talked about before, is a description of all sorts of things. It's not a single goal that might be the outcome that you want. There's a whole lot of outcomes and a whole lot of impacts all mixed up together. And it doesn't tell you exactly how you're going to get there. You're going to find out by having a go and noticing what's helping and noticing what isn't and responding accordingly. So you're much more in a mindset of awareness, looking for progress rather than completion, and being aware of other things that happen surprisingly. And if they're not happening the way that you wanted to, then stop. It's too late. Change it.
Yeah. And again, what I love about your Future Perfect, the way you describe it, is its complexity.
Yes. It's very complex. And in the real sense of people describing it with each other, I've done this with many, many teams in organizations, of what would it be like if we were operating as a really productive and successful team, and tell us in enormous detail. They go, oh yeah, it'd be this, it'd be that, and there's lots and lots of parts to it. And they go, oh, we're already doing that bit, and it's very easy if we're doing that bit to see how we could do this bit. And you go, yeah, that's it, do it tomorrow and see if that really is true, and if it is, keep doing it. And it makes for a surprisingly rapid progress when people get the hang of that way of working.
Okay, brilliant. So to sum up then, Paul, what would you, so thinking about presence, emergence and impact, how would you sum these things up in terms of how you approach your work?
I need to remind myself to be more present. That is, attentive to what's going on right now and to what's around me, the resources that I have, in order to get the progress towards those impacts that I want to make. And it's fine to speculate and dream about creating things and visionary and long-term impacts, as long as you do something today or tomorrow to start making them happen.
Small actions, yeah. Remember that about your work as well. Take very small actions, yeah. Sometimes sometimes people build these very, very grand dreams, and they're just so far removed from their current reality that they end up doing nothing whatsoever to take even a tiny step towards them.
They're stuck because it's either too daunting, too far away, they don't know what to do first, or they're perfectionists and don't want to risk doing anything in case it doesn't all go absolutely perfectly. But we're saying the vision, you may or may not accomplish it, you may never get there in your lifetime, or perhaps you will, who knows? But let's start going towards it now by doing something. And then, as you were saying earlier, look at what happens when you do that, the feedback, the complex loops, the ripples and the patterns that you create with other people. It's often done collaboratively. And if you're getting towards where you want to go, then that process is in itself worthwhile and will spin off more unexpected things that you can respond to and enjoy and adapt to for your next step. I'd call it life.
You know, it reminds me of these lottery winners. You know, sometimes people win millions, and the research has shown that they end up losing their money within about 5 years. And that's because they haven't transformed themselves. They are still the same person who was, you know, maybe unemployed or poor or didn't have, you know, who wasn't a millionaire. And they haven't allowed themselves to emerge as the more confident, more powerful, more influential person who can handle, you know, millions of pounds.
That's very interesting, the way we tell stories about ourselves, or how we identify and consider ourselves to be. And I don't think identity is as fixed as the lottery winner who can't change. I mean, I agree with you that does happen, but it's because we think of identity as fixed. If we thought of it as more flexible, it's everything that's happened to me up to now, including that win, then I'm now a person with that amount of money or with that resource. And that puts me in a different position in relation to what I might do, how I might work, what I might buy, and all sorts of other areas of our life, much more flexible. And we can revisit that every day or every now and again, if it's going to take up too much time to rethinking your identity every day. But we can rethink who we are, who are the friends that I'm associating with, what does that say about me? And we can change the narrative of our own lives by noticing what's happening and by deciding how we want that narrative to go. Everything in the future is speculation. None of that's fixed at all. So if you want to start telling a different story because you're aiming at a different place, then we can do that. And I think we're freer to do that than a lot of people realise. And I'm not saying that we don't have social circumstances or conditions from which we begin. Of course we do, but that can be taken into account as well.
Yes, it's as though like our own personal adaptation needs to be in ecological harmony with the adaptation of those around us. And you know, the person who's won millions of pounds, they may be very good at adapting on a personal level, but their family can't keep up with them, and therefore, you know, they have a choice of either being isolated out of their context. And so, yes, it can lead to an emergence of things that they are not resilient enough to be able to deal with.
Yes, that's right. The word choice is very important. So we can choose our next step, although not in circumstances of our choosing. I think there's Steve Jones, or one of the biologists, who said that we are free to choose, but not in circumstances of our own choosing. So yes, there's a starting position, there are things around us, there are resources available, and from there we can make our first step in the direction that we want to go. And it may or may not succeed, but if you don't know what it is, then you're a lot less likely to do it and find that success. And I think that also is the act of creation. It's making decisions based on what's around you to make something different from what was there before.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Paul. I've had such pleasure having this conversation with you, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon, Paul.
Thanks, Jesvir. My pleasure too. Thanks very much for reading the book and choosing to have the conversation. Delighted.
Excellent book and excellent conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.